The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Ling. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, we are going to war against the mythos with Mark Harrigan, the new investigator for the Guardian class from the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion. This is the first in a series of videos that are going to be looking at the investigators in the Path to Carcosa. The one exception to that will be Lola Hayes, who I looked at in a previous video. There's a link to that video in the description below. So, will this tireless soldier emerge victorious in his battle against the monsters that consumed his dear Sophie, or will he be driven mad in the process? Let's find out. Mark Harrigan has 3 willpower, 2 intellect, 5 combat, and 3 agility. He has the veteran trait. You begin the game with Sophie in loving memory in play. Harrigan has the following response after damage is placed on a card you control. Draw 1 card, limit once per phase. His Elder Sign effect is +1 for each damage on Mark Harrigan. He has 9 health and 5 sanity. Now, Mark Harrigan reminds me a lot of Agnes Baker from the core set. One of the reasons that Agnes is so much fun to play is that her sanity is treated as a resource. If you manage her sanity carefully, you can do a ton of extra damage to enemies without making skill tests. Now, Harrigan is similar in that his health is treated as a resource, which can be used to generate card advantage. Drawing extra cards is a powerful ability, and Harrigan can draw up to 4 extra cards per turn if he's able to spread out the damage he takes between the mythos, investigation, enemy, and upkeep phases. Drawing all those extra cards lets him dig for his weapons, allies, and other key pieces of his strategy that much faster. It also fills up his hand with cards, which you can always pitch to skill tests. Now, extra card draw is amazing, but all those extra cards means that Harrigan is liable to burn through his deck much more quickly than other investigators. And it does cost Harrigan a sanity to reshuffle, and he does not have a lot of extra sanity to spare, so players are going to need to be cautious how often they trigger Harrigan's response, especially during scenarios like those in the Dunwich Legacy cycle that forced you to discard cards off the top of your draw deck. It is important to point out one big difference between how Mark Harrigan and Agnes Baker's abilities work. As long as Agnes has sanity, she can keep pumping out the damage as much as she pleases, and that's not necessarily the case with Mark's card draw. Harrigan appears to have 9 health to play with, but it's actually more like 4, because once he takes that 5th damage, bad things tend to happen. Harrigan's Elder Sign effect also gets better with each damage he takes. Unfortunately, it's impossible to predict when you're going to pull an Elder Sign from the Chaos Bag, so you really can't count on that bonus when you need it. Harrigan's stats are solid with the glaring exception of his 2 intellect. If the Dunwich Legacy cycle taught us anything, it's that investigators with low intellect need to find ways to mitigate that disadvantage quickly, or run the risk of running headlong into a brick wall of a high shroud location, unable to make any progress. I'm thinking of a scenario here like the Miskatonic Museum or the Essex County Express. And in some scenarios, like where doom awaits, even those answers aren't going to be enough to pass difficult investigate checks at high shroud locations. Now, fortunately, Harrigan is in a better position than most investigators because he begins the game with Sophie in play. Players will find themselves leaning heavily on Sophie's ability to pass investigate checks until they're able to drop a flashlight or draw a perception or 2. When it comes to building a Mark Harrigan deck, players aren't going to have many options starting out. The deck is probably going to look a lot more like a Zoe Samaras deck than one for Roland Banks. Harrigan's deck size is the standard 30 cards, but he can only include level 0 to 5 Guardian and neutral cards, as well as level 0 tactic cards. There are 17 cards with the Tactics trait in the game, and 7 of those are in the Guardian class. The only tactic card that Harrigan can't take is Flare, the level 1 survivor card, which was released in the Miskatonic Museum. Unfortunately for Mark, few of the out-of-class tactic cards are going to make the cut in his deck. Shortcut is probably the best of the lot. It's an amazing addition to a Mark Harrigan deck, providing him with extra mobility in solo or multiplayer. You can also use it as a pseudo-dodge against many of the massive enemies that you will encounter as you play the scenarios. I've used Shortcut in a bunch of different decks, and I'm never sad to draw it. A free move for 0 resources is definitely welcome in Guardian, which can tend to struggle in the resource department. The other 2 Seeker cards are never going to see the light of day in a Harrigan deck. Barricade, I've never gotten to work in any deck I've played, and I think it's just terrible. And I've got a plan swaps Harrigan's strongest stat for his weakest in combat, and I think you'll agree that makes absolutely no sense. The tactic cards in Rogue offer Harrigan extra mobility and damage. Elusive is probably the best of them by a wide margin. Much like Shortcut, it can come in really handy if you need to avoid a traffic jam of enemies or reach a certain location quickly, which is often the case in scenarios like the House Always Wins or extracurricular activity. It also has that all-important intellect icon. Elusive does cost 2 resources though, which is the main reason I prefer Shortcut. Backstab and Sneak Attack might find homes in a Harrigan deck, although I'm not sure either is an ideal choice. Both have combat icons, which is positive. Backstab is very pricey though at 3 resources. However, it can be a nice tool to have at your disposal if you're fighting enemies like the conglomeration of spheres, for example, which has a low combat total, a lot of health, and a nasty combat ability. Harrigan's agility is okay at 3, but it's not something I'd want to count on, especially when he's got a combat of 5. You're probably better off packing a 32 Colt than Backstab. And I'm not convinced Sneak Attack is going to see much play in Harrigan decks either. Sneak Attack's ability to dish out damage by making skill checks is really appealing. It's too bad the enemies need to be exhausted though, and Harrigan clearly prefers dispatching enemies rather than evading them. Sneak Attack is likely better in multiplayer as long as Harrigan is teamed up with an investigator who can evade the enemies for him. There are only 2 tactic cards in Survivor, Cunning Distraction in the core set and Hiding Spot from the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion. I highly doubt you're ever going to see Cunning Distraction in a Mark Harrigan deck. Evading enemies isn't part of his game plan, and it's really, really expensive at 5 resources. While I quite like Hiding Spot, it's unlikely to find a home in the quote-unquote traditional Mark Harrigan build. Harrigan prefers fighting to sneaking around, and he's probably already packing dodge, or I've had worse, if he needs to avoid getting hit. Hiding Spot's double agility icons would help Harrigan in the rare event that he needs to evade an enemy. Again, I think Hiding Spot might fit better in a more agile Harrigan build, if such a deck exists, and I'm not really sure it does, given the current card pool. Mark Harrigan's deck includes 3 signature cards, and Sophie is by far the most important of them. Sophie is an asset with the item and spirit traits that begins the game in play. It cannot leave play, and it has the free trigger, take 1 direct damage. You get +2 to your skill value for this skill test. However, she also has the forced effect if Mark Harrigan has 5 or more damage on him. Flip Sophie. Once Sophie is flipped, she loses the spirit trait and gains the madness trait, and Harrigan gets -1 to each of his skills. And it has the forced effect if Mark Harrigan has 4 or less damage on him. Flip Sophie. Now, Sophie is Harrigan's greatest strength and potentially his greatest weakness. In an ideal world, Harrigan can hit up Sophie for a skill boost 4 times before she starts to become a liability. There is no limit to the number of times Harrigan can use Sophie during a skill test, so if there is a skill test you absolutely need to pass, Sophie is your answer. Sophie's flip side is pretty debilitating though, so if you're going to need to pack some healing to make sure Harrigan's memories of Sophie remain happy ones. Managing the amount of damage on Harrigan to remain under Sophie's threshold is crucial. Healing cards such as Emergency Aid, Allies, or cards like True Grit can go a long way to keeping Harrigan in fighting shape. Now, I can't stress enough how important Sophie is to Mark's success. She really inspires him to pass those critical skill tests as he gets set up, and she can help shore up his weaknesses later in the game. If you manage the amount of damage on Mark carefully, Sophie can really help him pull off some truly heroic feats. Harrigan's other two signature cards are the Homefront and Shell Shock, respectively. The Homefront is a skill with 4, yes, that's 4 combat icons and the practice and expert traits. It has the following game text: if this skill test is successful during an attack, move 1 damage from Mark Harrigan to the attacked enemy. Harrigan can use the Homefront to boost his already exceptional combat abilities or help another investigator take down a tough enemy. The fact that the Homefront lets Harrigan move 1 damage from himself to the enemy is fantastic, especially against enemies with odd health totals. And sometimes that little bit of pseudo-healing is all you need to boost another skill test with Sophie toward the end of a scenario. Harrigan's signature weakness is Shell Shock. It has the revelation: for every 2 damage on you, take 1 horror. If Harrigan has taken any horror during a scenario, Shell Shock certainly has the potential to drive him insane. However, I think if you're playing smart and you're managing the amount of damage on Harrigan, you should only take 1 or 2 horror from this card most of the time. And sometimes it's going to whiff entirely, and really you can't ask for much more from a weakness than that. I think it's important to note that Harrigan's ability to draw extra cards really increases the likelihood that you're going to draw a Shell Shock at some point during this scenario, so it's important to be prepared to deal with it. That means packing healing to keep Harrigan's damage in check and recruiting allies who can shore up his relatively low sanity. So what does a Mark Harrigan deck look like? Well, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think you're going to see a lot of diverse builds until there is a greater selection of out-of-class tactic cards available. Once you include the essentials such as machetes, flashlights, emergency cache, and skill cards, you're not going to have many deck slots available for tricks. Now, here's a deck that I've been using lately, and I'll be the first to admit that I'm not the greatest deck builder in the world, so this is just an example of what's possible. It's certainly not a definitive build in any sense of the word. That said, I've been pretty happy with how this deck has worked out. It's got the 32 Colt and the Machete for offense. It has it's packing If It Bleeds and Emergency Aid for sanity recovery and healing. There's a smoking pipe in there for extra card draw and sanity recovery late in the game. The shortcut is my tactic card of choice. It's great for the extra movement, and it works wonders also against those massive enemies. And really, this deck is going to rely heavily on Sophie until we can get set up and find a flashlight in evidence or perception to fuel our investigate checks. Now, I think Emergency Aid is really an essential addition to a Mark Harrigan deck. You need some way to heal the damage on Harrigan to prevent Sophie from flipping, and I think Emergency Aid is the best card that we have available right now. I was tempted to add a copy or 2 of First Aid to my Harrigan deck, but I've really never been a fan of that card. It just seems way too slow. And in the end, I decided to leave it out, and I didn't really regret the decision. Emergency Aid worked out really well until I could afford to pick up a couple of copies of I've Had Worse, which helps mitigate some of that damage and horror. But if you do want the extra insurance, you could certainly give First Aid a try. Now, Harrigan will be expected to kill a lot of enemies, so a copy of If It Bleeds seems like an obvious include. When you've got a sanity of 5, every sanity counts, and so it's nice to have that If It Bleeds. The two cards I'm not entirely sold on are the True Grit and the Smoking Pipe. Like I mentioned in my review of the Guardian cards, I really want to like True Grit, but it can be challenging to come up with the 3 resources for the 3 extra health when you've got other priorities, like shoring up Mark Harrigan's sanity. I think Harrigan is probably better off upgrading to an ally like Brother Xavier, who comes with 3 health, 3 sanity, a willpower boost, and a very useful special ability in solo play. When I was testing this deck, I did swap out True Grit for a copy of I've Had Worse, and I really didn't miss it. Now, Painkillers makes the cut in Agnes Baker decks for its combo potential, which makes Smoking Pipe seem like it's an obvious inclusion in Mark Harrigan. You can use it to take a damage, to heal a horror, and draw a card. However, Harrigan doesn't have a lot of spare health in those scenarios where he's forced to rely heavily on Sophie to pass skill tests. That said, Smoking Pipe can make a huge difference late in a scenario when Harrigan is usually on the brink of going insane. Every sanity counts, and Smoking Pipe has helped me win games I probably would have lost otherwise, so that is definitely reason enough to consider it for your deck. Now, typically when I sit down to prepare these segments, I like to include a sample game so that you guys can get an idea of how the investigator plays during a scenario. And I have to admit that I enjoyed playing Mark Harrigan so much that the sample game turned into a sample campaign, which I will be posting over the coming days. I'm not sure whether I'll have time to do that for all the investigators, but with Mark Harrigan, he was a lot of fun to play. I wasn't sure how he was going to perform in solo, but he turned out to be surprisingly resilient and powerful. You tend to really lean on Sophie until you can set up, but once you do, and you're able to heal some of that early damage off Harrigan, he can grind out the win. And he could even hold his own against scenarios in which he's not favored, such as the Miskatonic Museum and Undimensioned and Unseen. I'm really looking forward to seeing how Mark Harrigan evolves as more tactic cards are released. His deck building is a little bit restrictive right now. He doesn't have I don't think you're going to see a lot of different types of builds, but I think if you pick up the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion, don't hesitate to take Mark for a spin. He is a trooper, and he will not let you down. That's going to do it for my look at Mark Harrigan. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you could leave me a thumbs up. It helps out the channel a great deal. Do you agree or disagree with what I've said about Mark Harrigan? Or you just want to share your stories with this investigator? Please leave a comment down below. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of when I release future content. If you'd like to contact me, I can be reached at manfromlang@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromlang. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.